That was exciting. All right. All right. So my name's Dane. I work at the Santa Monica Bay Foundation. I'm one of the watershed technicians. I've been at the Bay Foundation for about 2 months now, and I just met Michael there last week when he came out and helped us out a little bit. So I'll just kind of tell the story of my career, and hopefully it's helpful for you guys. It's a little bit unconventional, so yeah, hopefully that shows that you can end up in a pretty interesting place regardless of where you start out, and you probably won't expect where you're going to end up. So there we go. So I grew up in upstate New York. This is a shot of Thatcher Park, which is one of my favorite hiking places, kind of near where I grew up. It's just outside Albany. Growing up, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I always liked the environment. I always loved being outdoors, and I especially loved the ocean. And half of my family was in California. So when I went to college, I seized that opportunity to come out to the West Coast and live by the beach. And I went to UC Santa Barbara, which was about as close to the beach as I could get for a college campus. And it was a great experience. That being said, I think I wish I had taken better advantages of some of the opportunities that I had there. And I'll get back to that a little bit more later on. But while I was there, the really only research experience that I had was working in the Pisco lab. So there we go. So the Pisco lab is one of the many labs on campus at UCSB. I worked on some of their invertebrate recruitment studies, which is a long-term study on invertebrates in the kelp forests around the Channel Islands. And that's one of the regrets I have is I did work there. At the time, I had some health issues to deal with, but I really didn't get nearly as involved as I wish I had now. So I worked in the lab, did some identification stuff, went out in the field with them once or twice, but I wish I had really dived into that. It was a missed opportunity. And so if you guys have chances like that, don't miss out on them. So after school, that's where my career took kind of a detour. I wanted to do something a little bit more interesting, a little more exciting, and I had some experience. I had an EMT certificate, so I had some medical experience. I had years of martial arts training, and I ended up working for an executive protection company doing high-profile security and event planning. And so this is our little graduation photo over there. Oops, too soon. There we go. We look ridiculous, but that's all right. So I worked there for almost 3 years, and I realized that I really didn't care for what I was doing. I was spending a lot of time, a lot of energy doing something that I didn't particularly enjoy for the benefit of people I didn't particularly respect. And so I really wanted to get back to what I cared about and what I was passionate about, which was the environment, and particularly the coastal and marine environments. And I have this picture of Dr. Varon because there was a quote from him in a movie I watched called Chasing Coral that really stuck with me, which, let me not misquote it. He's talking about dealing with coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. And he just says to a young up and coming scientist that you've really got to keep at it. Otherwise, you're not going to like yourself when you're an old man. And that quote really stuck with me, that the money I was making wasn't worth it. The possibilities there weren't what I wanted to be doing. So I decided to get back towards the environmental field. And when the opportunity presented itself, I took a part-time environmental field technician position at the United Water Conservation District up in Ventura. And here's just a quick list of some of the things we were doing up there. So field work involved a lot of water sampling. So the Water Conservation District there basically controls Lake Piru, which is a reservoir that feeds the groundwater for the Ventura watershed. And the environmental team there, mainly their job was to make sure that all the environmental regulations were being followed so that the company wouldn't get sued any more than they already do. So we dealt with invasive species, we dealt with water quality, making sure that the customers were getting the water that they wanted. Some of the native species that we were particularly interested in were the Southern California steelhead trout, which is an endangered subspecies that's federally listed. So a lot of effort went into protecting them and making sure that they had open passage through our water system. And a couple different bird species, but particularly the least bell's vireo, which is a tiny little brown bird that you would never notice. But if you know the song, it's quite distinctive. Um, and another example of field work was construction monitoring. So being a water district, they always had pretty large scale operations going on all the time. And one of the last ones I was involved with was a dredging project to reopen up part of the waterway. And the environmental permitting on that was an absolute nightmare. But once we got it going, we were the environmental monitors on site watching the construction happen and making sure that the wildlife impact was minimized as much as possible. And so if you guys end up in the environmental field, especially in the earlier parts of your career, that's very likely something you'll be doing. We also had a little bit of lab work. So in that lake, we have quagga mussels, which are an invasive mussel species, and they're basically impossible to get rid of once you have them in your lake system. So they've basically taken over the entire lake. And I wish I had some pictures, but we had dive teams that would go underneath the docks and things and scrape them off. And one of their removal events, they pulled several, I think 100 tons of mussels out of the lake. And they just came back the next year. So it was a never-ending task to try to deal with the mussel problem. And we were looking into eradication studies, and some of the more interesting work I did there was research projects on chemical additives to the water or other ways that we might actually be able to eradicate the mussels, but we never came up with anything feasible that wouldn't have serious impacts for the rest of the watershed. So a couple pictures from working there. Here's the lake itself. Down to the right there, that's actually the dam. And to the left, you see that spillway. So if the lake got too high, it would spill over that way. And here's some shots of us in the field. So the top shows just kind of a panorama of the lake. And every day, almost every day, we were out on the boat or out on the lake. And it was just a nice place to be. Kind of over on the side there, you have one of my coworkers in a dry suit diving, trying to take a look for some of those steelhead trout because we thought we saw one. And so one fish basically stopped the entire operation of the whole company until we figured out whether it was a steelhead trout or not, because if it was, we couldn't do anything anywhere near them out of fear, I guess. So the center shot there was also a really interesting project. We were electrofishing, which is basically tasing fish to stun them enough to be able to capture them and then tag them with radio tags. And this was intended to be an ongoing study to get an idea of where the trout in that river system actually were and how many of them were coming up and downstream into our waterways. And then over on the right, I just have a little ArcGIS map that I put together for a sediment survey that we were doing. So that dredging project I mentioned, at the bottom corner, you can kind of see our outlet works. And as the river was coming in, it was bringing in a very significant amount of sediment, which was blocking everything. And so this was just an ongoing way of tracking just how much sediment was moving into the facilities. And there we go. Yeah, okay. So after I worked there for 6 months to a year or so, I got into a master's program at Loyola Marymount in the environmental engineering department. And so I'm about 2 classes away from finishing that. And I'm working on my master's thesis. Neither of these are mine, unfortunately. We're still trying to get funding for some of the parts, so I haven't built mine yet. But I will be constructing a USV, so unmanned surface vehicle, to do nearshore bathymetric surveys using sonar. So just a small remote controlled boat to run sonar transects up and down the nearshore area. And we're really trying to get an idea of what the sand and what the water quality is just offshore there, and looking at that over time, looking at the seasonality, and then looking at it alongside the Bay Foundation's restoration projects to see how our restoration work is actually impacting coastal erosion and coastal water quality. So these pictures I snagged from Blue Robotics website. They're one of the people we're buying a bunch of parts from, and they've helped out a lot with my project. This was what started their company, is this little solar surfer, which is actually going to be pretty similar to what I'm building. And on the right, you have their ROV, which we're also operating in conjunction with my project. And that takes me to today, which is the Bay Foundation. So here's Michael helping out with one of our projects. That is the Santa Monica Beach Restoration Project. And the left picture is a little grainy, but it gives you kind of an idea of what we're going for, which is to restore the perfectly groomed Los Angeles beaches to a more natural, hilly, duney environment with some vegetation in there, some native vegetation that will help retain sand as it blows across. So the idea with these is to restore the dunes, and then as you have sea level rise, as you have increasing erosion, the sand that these native plants are catching and accreting is actually going to help build that beach back up and make it last a lot longer and prevent some of the coastal erosion with a relatively low cost of installation and upkeep. And this is an alternative to some of the hard defensive measures like building essentially concrete walls, sea walls, and things like that, or shore breaks, which actually end up causing more erosion over time. They're not super effective long term, and they're really destructive to neighboring areas. They can not only increase erosion where they are, but upstream and downstream, depending on the tidal currents going on. And those are all the pictures I had time to put in. I just put this together in the last hour, so unfortunately, it's not the best presentation. But a couple things, so a couple other things that the Bay Foundation does, if I can get my cursor to work. Go. A couple other things that we're doing is wetland restoration. So if you guys are familiar with the Ballona wetlands, it's right over by LMU's campus, and it's one of the most heavily impacted wetlands, our coastal wetlands in California. And a big project that we have going in the next 2 weeks actually is a substantial restoration of some of the vegetation there. And I think Michael's going to be out there helping us out with that one too. And the idea is, again, to mitigate the environmental impact of climate change and to try to preserve as much natural environment as possible, because even though the Ballona wetland is a relatively small area looking at it, it can have really substantial impacts on the watershed up and downstream of that area. So it's a pretty cool job to have. And
I think there's a question in the chat about, I think it's the Santa Monica site. What types of native plants might occur in those areas?
Sure. If I had better pictures, I would show you. On the beach dunes, so there's probably 5 or 6 plants that we usually see in the Santa Monica site. Camisoniopsis chanthifolia, so we call it catch. It's beach evening primrose is one. They're these kind of leafy, you can kind of see it in this grainy picture, but a lot of these kind of small leafy semi-succulent plants that are native to the dune systems, but have been removed by the constant grading. And if you go down to the beach, a lot of times what you'll see is the perfectly graded sand, and then where there is vegetation, it'll be pure ice plant. And ice plant's not native. It chokes out all of the native species. It's not a good habitat for anything around there. And so we try to remove that as much as possible. And actually, interestingly, ice plant also doesn't do as good a job of building up those dunes as these native species do. So they build the dunes better, and they provide the native environment that you would be looking for. Another especially important one is the sea cliff buckwheat, which is a bit bushier. So you wouldn't see it down on the sand there, but on the closer inside the kind of upper dune areas, sea cliff buckwheat is the only plant species that the El Segundo blue butterfly lives on. So that's a really important one that we're trying to get to as many places as possible to try to spread the butterfly, because it's very endangered and it's very endemic to only this area. So that's kind of a cool one. Is there another question? Oh, no, we're good. Okay, cool. So just a couple thoughts I had in closing. Don't make the mistakes I did. So you guys are at UCLA, and obviously you're here, so you're already being more proactive than I was back in the day. But take advantage of every opportunity that you have. Like, be proactive, go out there, grab those internships, like go talk to professors. Usually professors get pretty stoked when you actually go engage with them. I didn't figure that out until grad school, and now I know all my professors, and they're fantastic resources to have. Um, Second thing is making connections. You don't really know what connections will be useful when you're making them a lot of the times. So one of the best connections I have is my friend who's getting his PhD at UCSB when I was there. And he ended up getting me to talk to the director of the grad school program that I'm in now. And he got me to come out to one of the volunteer events with the Bay Foundation where I now work. So he was a fantastic connection to have and a great friend. Um, yeah, and I think that's about all I've got. The last thing I'll say is like working in the environmental field, as you guys probably know, is never going to make you rich. But going from my security job where I made pretty decent money to working on the beach, I'll take the beach every day. I have the best office in the world, and I enjoy everyone that I work with and what I'm doing. So it's absolutely worth it. So, any questions you guys have?
I think we'll save those questions until like after both speakers go, if that's okay with you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever works for you guys.
Cool. All right, Lisa, whenever you're ready, you can have your talk.
All right, I guess I have to unmute. Hi, I'm Lisa Vebber, and I work at the California Wildlife Center, which is in Calabasas, Malibu. And but I've taken quite a different path to get to where I am. This is my second career. I started in entertainment, actually. I'm from Colorado. My dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. Then I went to Pepperdine for undergraduate, and I went to USC for my first master's in communication management. And then I went into entertainment, and I spent almost 20 years in television as a TV executive, doing a lot of research for television. So it's a very transferable skill, oddly enough, if you know how to, look at numbers, interpret numbers, and find stories and stuff out of the data. You can do that with anything, whether it's TV shows, actors, animals, whatever. So that's been really helpful for me as I transition into more of a research type job in ecology. So I burned out of entertainment after 20 years. I had a lot of fun. I spent my last 10 years at NBC. I was doing all of the planning, scheduling, and acquisitions for the primetime schedule. So that was quite a different job. So I left that job, did some soul searching, and decided I wanted to go after my, childhood dream of being a vet, although I didn't want to go to vet school. But I always wanted to be a vet since I was like 6 years old, and I kind of put it on the side because I think I had a bad chemistry teacher in high school. And then I think I lost all confidence in my ability to do science. And so I went in a different direction. And so I was really scared when I went back for my second master's, which I finished last year. I have a master's in biology, and basically it's very conservation focused. But I was really terrified that I would be terrible at it, especially after not being in school for quite some time. But it was awesome because I found out I'm actually pretty good at it and I really love it. So this has been a whole new experience for me. And just been really great. So I guess my first word of advice is if you've had a bad teacher, or if you had like a bad experience in a class in your earlier years, but it's still an area you're interested in, try again. I wish I had. And I think, with women, especially in sciences, I think, especially in sort of my era, I'm not that old, but, I don't think there was as much encouragement for women. So, but now I see in my animal area that it's more women than men in a lot of the work that I do. So I also was a professor at USC for almost 10 years, teaching graduate school at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism. I taught a lot of data classes on data science and interpretation. And I structured my last couple classes on how to interpret data for nonprofit. So we looked at a lot of the publicly available data sets that you can find all over the internet, NOAA, and, just there's so many data sets that you could use. So we did a lot of work on that. And it was just a really fun way to kind of cross my two interests of entertainment. They all wanted to just talk about TV all the time, but I was trying to talk about Africa all the time, but it all worked out. So I stopped teaching at USC, and then I went to Miami University of Ohio for my master's in biology. And it was a joint program between Miami University and San Diego Zoo Global. So I did a lot of coursework online, and then all of my in-person work was done at either the San Diego Zoo or the Wild Animal Park, or the Institute of Conservation Research, which is a part of San Diego Zoo Global, which I didn't know existed until I went to school there. And so it was a really unique type of program where we had access to scientists that were coming and speaking to us every time we were down there. I did some of my graduate work on actual projects that San Diego Zoo Global is funding. For example, one of my last ones was a huge, it was almost like an audit of a conservation program in Kenya, which was designed to deal a lot with the human wildlife conflict and protect the leopards, because there's a lot of pastoralists and farmers in Kenya, and they were just overlapping with the leopards, and they want to kill the leopards because they blame the leopards for killing their livestock, and that's their livelihood. So they don't want them around, but we obviously want to protect the leopards. So we came up with all sorts of ideas and audited the ones that had been tried on ways to mitigate and teach them other ways so that they wouldn't harm the leopards, but they could protect their livestock better. So that was cool. And that's after a few other internships and stuff that I did in Africa. Obviously, I'm obsessed with Africa and African animals and African ecology. So that's really my first love. So that's what I really dove into in my graduate work. And I found being older was nice because I had more confidence and understanding of how to find internships, talking to people and things like, so I just wasn't as shy as I think I was when I was, you know, in my 20s, when you don't know anything and you're afraid to ask anything. So my advice to you, which I always gave to my other students, is just go for it. You know, I think as Dane said, you know, most professors are really excited to talk about something they love. And, you know, I met with one of the labs, Dan Bloomstein at UCLA about PhD work, the Marmot guy. And once I got him going, man, he just loves talking about it. And I think we all do when you're excited about what you do. So I would just engage people as much as possible. And I, you know, unfortunately, with a lot of conservation work, as you know, Dane says, you don't do it to make money, and you have to often kind of have to pay to get your experience. I was fortunate enough that I was coming off of a career that made money. So I had some money that I was able to fund several trips to Africa and do some internships and just get some more real world experience that, you know, I think was, you know, I know a lot of people can't do that are younger and maybe don't have, you know, wealthy parents or something to do it. But if you can do it, I think it's money well spent, because it really is that hands-on experience and making those connections that is going to change your career. And it's changed mine in very unexpected ways. I also love what Dane said. I'm going to go through, I threw together some pictures as well, because, you know, it's more fun than staring at me the whole time. But I did an internship at the Cheetah Conservation Fund in Namibia a couple of years ago. And here I thought, like, yeah, this is going to be it. I'm going to do like an ongoing collaboration with them, because I was involved in their fundraising in the States, and I thought it was going to be great. And then I got nothing from them. It was really not, I guess this is being recorded, but it was a terrible internship, and it was really disappointing. But afterwards, my friend and I had booked a week of safari, and I wanted to visit some other organizations in Namibia. So I went afterwards to a place called Africat, an organization that is also a big cat conservation place. And I just asked as a tourist if I could meet with their research person, because they do a lot of research. And they set it up. So I met with her for like 20 minutes when I was there. And that actually turned into a collaboration where she and I we published a paper together. So I got my first professional publication, my peer-reviewed publication, because of that random contact that I talked to for 20 minutes at AFRICAT. So, and that was really special, even though, I worked my ass off for 2 weeks, at cheetah conservation, like picking up cheetah everything and feeding. I mean, it was a lot of work and nothing really came of that, but you just never know where it's going to come from. And in fact, she was on, I'm working towards getting into a PhD program, and her name is Sarah. I had my PhD project. She was my co-advisor. I was going to do it with AFRICAT. Everything was going. We were setting up the proposal, and then COVID hit, and they cut all their research funding, and it just poof, disappeared. So now I'm starting over. But you just never know who you're going to spark with. And another example is there's an organization called Earthwatch. I don't know, has anybody heard of Earthwatch? It's a volunteer vacation type of thing, but it's all research based. So anyone can go, and you can select, what region, what animal, what area, or if you want to do, water or whatever it is, and you go on these trips, and you are actually assisting on research studies with scientists in the field. And the thing I like about it is they're really good about explaining why you're doing what you're doing, showing you how to do it. And then afterwards, they follow up with the finished report so you can see what was done with your data, which is really cool, because I like a lot of things I think you just never hear again. So through that, I met, at the first one I did in South Africa, I met a colleague who then collaborated in one of my USC classes the following year, and I'm still in touch with him. And then the following year I went to Malawi, and I just clicked with that scientist. And in fact, I went back and stayed in her research camp last year, a couple years later, and spent a couple weeks just with her and her 2 grad students, just in the field, just kind of getting the feel of what it's like to run a research camp in the bush in a park in Malawi. And you just never know. So I've had some really cool experiences just from putting myself out there. And I was a research volunteer at the LA Zoo. I had to take a UCLA extension class to do animal behavior, but that was also another great experience where, you get to, it's good practice at data collection. The staff there doesn't really let you do much with the data afterwards, but as far as like, if you're interested in animal behavior and different research methods of scan sampling and practicing all of the identifications and stuff like that, it's a interesting thing to do. It's an interesting volunteer thing to do. So I highly recommend that for those that are interested in animals. Any questions before I just dive into I have a few slides on Africa, and then I was going to talk about the California Wildlife Center, my current job, and show lots of cute pictures of animals. Does anybody?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate on what you think makes an internship worthwhile, especially since a lot of them are unpaid and you have had a bad experience with an internship in the past?
Yeah, that can be really tricky. I think it takes a lot of due diligence, especially if you're interested, like I was interested in Africa, and there's a zillion different volunteer and internship opportunities, but a lot of them are kind of dicey. Like a lot of them, you can end up being, helping like the lion trade of, raising lion cubs and not realize that you're actually helping, the big hunting, big game hunting. There's stuff like that. So I think you have to have, there are some organizations, I think, online that vet some of these internships. So I would suggest, if it's something like that, maybe trying to vet it to make sure it's legit, because especially in Africa and these other countries, they do a veil of conservation, but it's really not. It's really more commercial based, or just not quite what they're selling it to be. So Cheetah Conservation Fund is that. And I will say that bad internships can almost teach you more than good internships, because those lessons are really important as well. So I was able to see a nonprofit that does not function well and understand kind of like, wow, what's going on here? And I actually wrote a paper about it afterwards, because it was an independent study project for me about the growth of that. It's been there almost 30 years, the Cheetah Conservation Fund. And like, what happened? I'm sure I know it started from the right place. And then, you know, after 30 years and personnel and things, like things can shift and things can become dysfunctional. And kind of starting to understand why and how that happens is helpful, as most of us will probably be working for some sort of nonprofit at some point. Whereas I've also seen very good nonprofits, and I'm on the board of a couple of nonprofits. And I actually work with a nonprofit water charity. That's one of the board positions I hold. And we're very small and we're building it, but it's like learning from those bad experiences. I know like what I don't want to do in the new experiences. So no one sure tip, even the bad experiences are good. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's, you just got to do some due diligence. And plus, I think there's some listings. Is it the one that's through, what university is it? I can't remember. I just have it bookmarked, that has all the jobs and internships for sort of ecology.
I think it's Texas A&M.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that one.
Thank you.
So that's a good one. Yeah, of course. Okay, so I guess real quick, I'm not great at the zooming. So I want to share my screen. So do I just do like slideshow if I want to show pictures? And uh-oh, now I lost you guys. I have to share my screen first, right? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I made you a co-host, so you should have the ability to.
Okay, and then I want to show this PowerPoint. Sorry, I wasn't set up. Okay. I don't know if I can get this up here. This is driving me crazy. I did all this. Now I'm getting these firewalls. Let's see. All right. All right, let's see if I can get it. All right, so it's not working, is it? Let's see. I want to share. Okay, there we go. Is it working?
Yes,
Is
we can see it.
working? Okay, now I'll actually make it into a slideshow. All right, can you see that? Okay, oh, I think it's working. Okay, so the thing I'm most interested in for my PhD, et cetera, is the idea of reintroduction science, which involves translocation. So the idea of taking spaces that are no longer, have lost a lot of their wildlife for whatever reason. In Africa, it's primarily through poaching or government unrest in a lot of these developing countries that has caused them to lose most of their wildlife in a lot of places. And so I'm really interested in the idea of rebuilding these parks and, you know, starting with the vegetation, fencing them, getting, you know, rangers in place, and then starting to reintroduce the different species to rebuild the ecosystem. I'm most interested in Africa, but, you know, it's being done everywhere. So it's kind of a skill that you can use everywhere. The organization I've worked with that I really like is called African Parks. And they're based in the Netherlands, actually, but they have like 20 parks, more than that now, throughout Africa. And they make these sort of 20-year deals with the local governments that they will set up and create a tourist economy for, and they create jobs. They hire locals for rangers, they build schools, they have health clinics, they put in wells, et cetera, et cetera. And then after 20 years, the idea is that they can hopefully hand the park back to the country, and it's one of their jewels, and then they can start to rebuild. So that's their goal. So this particular project I did as a volunteer in Malawi. This is the first one I did, and it was translocating elephants. This was 2 or 3 years ago. It was a big, like, Prince Harry was all over the place. He went and did this, so he was on TV talking about it, and, you know, he wasn't there the day I was there, but so he's kind of given it some, I think he's like an honorary president or something of African parks. So what happened is Majeti Wildlife Reserve in Malawi, which is where I've spent a couple months at 2 different times there. They had an abundance of elephants. And, you know, the problem is when you're building these parks is they now have to be managed because, you know, unfortunately, we're in a time where truly wild without fencing, even if it's thousands of acres, it can't happen anymore with the population increases. It's like, so unfortunately we have to create spaces that are refuges for these animals. And because they cannot freely move outside, we have to manage within. So that means, you know, keeping the numbers right to that the ecosystem can sustain. So the example here was there was these elephants and they were just multiplying like crazy and they were destroying everything. And there was more than could be handled by the land. So they came up with a plan to move 500 elephants to 2 other parks that didn't have elephants in Malawi. So I got to do this for part of it, which was amazing. So we went and we had helicopters and darted these elephants, like a whole family at a time, like 10, 11 at a time. Then you get all these measurements, you're taking blood, you're doing all this stuff and weighing, and then they're pulling them up by their feet and putting them onto a truck, waking them up, and then they just drive them straight through to these other parks. So that was like the greatest day ever. I just love this kind of hands-on work. So that's a type of thing that you can do, which is really fun. It was just really amazing experience, just be there with these wild animals. I love giant megafauna, obviously. Then that year and the following year, I really am into rhino horn and poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. So this is the same park, this is Majetti, that has black rhino. So we were trying to dart them and put transmitters in their horns so that we could find them within the park, but also should they be poached, we would be able to track their horns. And, you know, there's shavings that you can see in some of these pictures. That is also a DNA sample. So like if things are caught, you can trace it back to the individual rhino and the place where it came from. So it's just another effort of anti-poaching and to protect these animals. You know, there's various different methods, but I won't go into that because that's a whole nother story. So that's some rhino tagging, another thing I love to do. It's super cool. Field work. I thought, yeah, I do run around, but I did do a lot of field work. I took a couple pictures of field work. So like we change camera traps, and my other favorite is doing water hole counts, that's me with the binoculars on the car, where you just sit at the water hole for 12 hours and you just log everything that comes and how many and what it is. And then you start building patterns and understanding of, you know, that's how you can start to estimate counts and things like that of what's going on in the park. And it was also just a really unique way to experience Africa because, well, Malawi, Africa is a continent, not a country. Because normally when you're on a safari, you're driving around, you're looking at animals, and then you go back. But to be in a stationary position that is a water hole where animals come, and to watch the ebb and flow of the day was really cool. It was a really different experience, and how the animals react to each other and things like that. So it's just all this stuff is just building information. And then we were doing some studies on fire. These are planned burns that we're studying, and we're just studying like how quickly browse is coming back and which animals are browsing on what and at what lengths as it's regrowing. Then I've also done, I went gorilla trekking last year as well and did a habituation process, which is for the gorilla tourism industry. You know, when you go trek with gorillas, they're wild gorillas, but they've been habituated to humans so that they don't run away. I mean, they're not aggressive, so they don't really want to kill you, but they would. So they go through like a 3 to 5 year process of habituation with rangers to get them ready to be able to accept tourists to come and view them. So I was part of that. Like later on in the process, they start bringing tourist type people. So I was able to get on one of them. So we went and followed them for 5 hours. It was like a 14-hour round trip thing. And they want you to make noises and do things that to desensitize the gorillas to, you know, camera clicks and, you know, people doing, you know, iPhone, whatever, you know, just anything that they would see from another human so that they would just ignore the humans and then we can watch them. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about it because, you know, it's a catch-22 because without the gorilla tourism, the gorillas probably would not be around anymore. But the gorilla tourism also feels a little bit exploitive. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but nothing is clean in conservation. It's just such a challenging field. So that's some of the field work. And this is the water charity that I work for. We drill boreholes for remote villages, schools, and here's a hospital for clean water. And it's really focused at female empowerment because it's a very patriarchal society. And the women sometimes have to walk 3 hours a day each way to get water for the village. And so these girls don't get to go to school. And it just becomes like a, vicious cycle. And these women can never get out of it and never better themselves. So this is a way of bringing, help to them. And it also it's just been a really meaningful thing for me to do also. And because conservation does not exist in a vacuum of the fish that you're working with or the animals that you're working with. It's really about the community that is around the conservation, especially like in Africa, because, the people that are doing the actual poaching are local people because, syndicates come in and they pay them money, which to them is huge because a lot of them are impoverished. And so they go in and kill the rhino because it's going to feed their family for a year. So, if you think, if I was in their shoes, I might do the same thing. So the idea with this sort of 360 approach to conservation is, you can't just ignore the people. They have to be on board to protect the animals as well, whether it's through creating jobs, providing services like medical and school, getting them to have pride in, the animals that are in their country, because it's a lot of, I'd say a majority of these indigenous people around these parks have never seen these animals because they'll go into the park. They'll maybe they've seen something that is a nuisance to their farm or whatever, but that's pretty much it. So there's a lot of education and things around trying to teach them to understand like the resources that their country has and how it's important to the world. And this is Namibia, where I worked at CCF. I don't want to run out of time and not get to my CWC stuff. There, it's a lot of it, they release some cheetahs, but not as many as you would hope, because it's very difficult to release cheetahs. They need a lot of space. They're solitary. They also are difficult to teach to hunt because if they're taken from their moms too early, and a lot of these orphan cheetahs are tiny because they're stolen for pet trade. I don't know if you've seen, just Google, like the Middle East, and you can find a bazillion pictures of dudes with like, a Rolls Royce and a tiger in the side, or a cheetah. It's like a total status thing to have an exotic, big cat. And so there's a huge illegal pet trade. So some of these are confiscated cheetahs, and some Namibia used to be able to have pet cheetahs until, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And once that was passed, all the pet cheetahs had to be turned over, and those can never be put in the wild because they would not survive. So a lot of these cheetahs end up living in this basically sanctuary, but some do get released. I found that Africat had a higher level of release of the cats, and actually my paper through Africat was cool. And this is where another way you can learn to make connections is I wrote a paper based on data they already had. I didn't do the field work because I couldn't go spend 6 months there. But so they just gave me a lot of these organizations, I'd say most, that they all collect data, but they have no one to process the data. So they have tons of data just sitting there. And, if that's how I got to do this paper, I said, do you have any data? I totally would crunch it. And like, is there any papers you're looking to write? And so that's what I did. So I took data that they had already collected, and the paper was about whether cheetahs that were released into the wild after being in captivity, did they have similar prey preferences and size of prey preferences as their only wild counterparts. And it's interesting because in captivity, cheetahs are mainly fed donkey meat because there isn't enough game to sustain them in that kind of a form. So I was curious too, you know, do they have a taste for donkey? Like, do they still like impala or whatever? So that's what the paper was on. And I think the positive thing is that they did kind of naturally go for similar prey choices. You can read my paper in the Namibian, whatever. I won't go into it, but it was a great experience. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm going to go on to CWC. Any quick questions about Africa before I move on to California? All right. Excuse me.
Were you holding a pangolin in the last
Yeah,
slide?
I forgot I was holding a pangolin. Yes. Yes, that's, yeah. There was a pangolin rescue, not rescue, but yeah, I guess rescue organization in Namibia as well. So I went and there's actually a really good PBS special that was out about maybe 2 or 3 years ago about pangolins. And the pangolin I'm holding was that, it's kind of a famous pangolin. Unfortunately, its name is Honeybun. Unfortunately, it died during COVID because they couldn't get the supplies they needed for the blood transfusions and stuff it needed because the borders were closed. It's really tragic. But anyway, you know, pangolins are the most trafficked animal in the world. I'd never seen one in person because they don't do well in captivity. So you'll very rarely see any in captivity. It was just amazing. It was like holding an artichoke, a raw artichoke. It was like just weird. And we walked with the pangolin while it fed, and it was pretty cool. And I think conservation is also about giving people a personal experience with the animal or whatever it is that you're trying to conserve. And that's the only way to make people care, is to create emotional connection. So it was pretty amazing for me to see the pangolin and hold the pangolin. It was just amazing. Yeah, so now I work at CWC, California Wildlife Center. I started as an intern there and then was hired to be a wildlife technician during my internship. I was very lucky in that someone left. So I got hired straight before I even finished my internship. And all of the technicians there came up as volunteers or interns first. So it's always a good path. Yeah, every single technician did. And Michael was one of our interns this summer. So he'll recognize some of these photos. And it is a great internship, I would say, right, Michael? Like, because it is
very much hands-on.
More hands-on than you want sometimes. Yeah, very hands-on. So I found it to be an amazing internship. And now Michael missed our vet because we were in between vets, but now we have a new vet who's amazing. And so just really learning tons. So I had no sort of medical experience and I learned everything on the job. And it's awesome. I didn't think I would love it so much. You know, primarily what a technician does is we do animal care. I work in the ICU. We also have an orphan care unit, which is just closed down for the season. So the ICU is just basically animal ER. And we take in patients. The patients come in from the public generally. So people that find there's a lot of people whose cat caught a bird or dog got a squirrel, or, you know, they find a bird with a broken wing or whatever injury they see, and they bring the animal to us. And then we try to, we have to unfortunately do triage, where if we cannot rehabilitate the animal to be able to survive on its own in the wild, we have to move on to another animal. We euthanize them. And it was really a hard thing for me to get used to at first, but, you know, there isn't enough sanctuary space to take all these injured animals. So it's really, we're their only chance. And if we can rehabilitate them, we do, and we love it. And if we can't, you know, we're just ending their suffering a much shorter time than if they were out in the wild with that injury or sickness. So that is the tough part. That's the worst part of the job. Like, who wants to do that? But it's a unfortunately, it's a pretty big part of it as well. But I'm going to focus on the ones that we do get to help. So what a technician does, it's basically a veterinary, like a vet tech in a domestic animal office. You know, we do almost everything but the surgeries, pretty much. You know, we diagnose, we do x-rays, we take blood, we do prescriptions, we prepare food and diets and habitats for the patients. Pretty much anything to do with everything to do with their care while they're with us, the technicians do, with the help of volunteers and interns. But the technicians sort of, they run the ER, and then has sort of a team of volunteers and interns that help get all the stuff done. Because, you know, in the summer, you know, we have hundreds and hundreds of animals at a time in the ICU or managed by the ICU, and the OCU just gets, you know, I think like a couple weeks ago, they had something like 80 baby squirrels in different ages. So that's kind of volume of the stuff that goes through. I think CWC sees something, it's like 5,000 plus animals a year or something like that. I think a large percentage of them are birds. I didn't know much about birds except raptors, of course, before, but now I actually really like birds, all sorts of birds. So that's kind of the gist of how CWC works. We're a nonprofit that's all privately funded. So here's some of the tools I'm using, you know, making shots, giving fluids, preparing diets, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's a snake. We had a snake most of the summer. It was pretty fun. It had a constriction wound, and it was wrapped in some wire, or like some fishing wire. And so we fixed it. It had to regrow some of its scoots, and we released it. So it's a happy ending. This little mole wasn't such a happy ending, but you know, it's a good picture. So one of the things that bothers me a lot as a illegal wildlife person is, especially the last couple of months, we've seen so many raptors that have with bullets. And so here's just a couple of examples. Like, we take x-rays, and here's a couple of bullets that we found in birds, and we have to euthanize almost all of them. And a lot of them are Cooper's hawks, which are a bit smaller hawk. And they're kind of like, if there's going to be a hawk at your bird feeder, it's going to be a Cooper's hawk, because they can't kind of hang around a lot closer to houses and things and feed off of birds. Anyway, so it's really frustrating. And actually, Department of Fish and Wildlife has just started working with us. We're submitting all of these cases to them, and they're following up on some of them. I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but we're giving them all of the information. We also run labs and look for usually just parasites. You know, I think that's coccidia, and that's mites for mange. And so we look for stuff, you know, and then prescribe medication to fix it. We do a lot of repair. Some of it's pretty incredible. This was such a memorable one. This is a pelican, and the upper left is the pelican's pouch was completely severed. So like, that's its entire pouch just hanging in one piece. And that's its neck that's exposed. It was crazy. And our vet stapled it back together. And then on the right, like, that's what the pelican looks like. And it's pretty, like, I couldn't believe that, you know, we were able to save a pelican that I just thought was like never going to make it. We work with another organization called the International Bird Rescue in Long Beach. And we send our water birds, like pelicans, down to them as soon as possible, because they're more able to care for them. So this pelican, after we just stabilized it and stapled it, went to them for reconstructive surgery. And I heard that it was released recently. So it's pretty cool that you can get a pelican that looks like that, and then now it's back out in the wild. And, you know, all of the sad things we have to do, like, it's such a great feeling when you get to release something in the wild. Michael remembered this one. This was like our superstar patient. This is a golden eagle, which it was awesome, but it was terrifying as well. He didn't make it, but you know, we have to say this eagle was found on a golf course, and like a couple of our technicians were able to capture it. that's not good. You should never be able to capture an eagle. So it was very sick as it was, but it was amazing to work on it, and the power of like the size of its talons, and it was just awesome. But so we were doing things like we're tubing, so we are gavage, feeding birds through tube like formula if they can't eat on their own. So we had to do that with this eagle several times a day. Michael did it many times. Well, a few times. This also had an eye infection, so we were treating the eye. And it was just a very cool and crazy thing to do, and dangerous. Working with wildlife is really awesome, but it can be quite dangerous. So we do take a lot of precautions. One thing I love that I didn't realize is there's a lot of tiny crafts involved. These are just some examples of the things we just do. Like, you know, little casts and little jackets for this and shoes for birds. And this squirrel friend was having a bad habit of sucking on his own parts and getting really irritated. So we had to put a cone of shame on him. Shame, yes. So that's what happened. We get tons of babies of everything. I mean, we treat, I think, over 150 different types of species, native California species, only native California. We don't take invasive species. So here's an example of some of the babies that have come through this summer. It's really so fun to just feed them and be around these teeny babies, and they have, it's fun. It's a lot of work when you're working in the orphan care unit because you're feeding them like every 40 minutes, and it gets a little old. But it's a really neat experience to, you know, kind of raise these things a little bit. And here's a couple examples of the growing up. So these are coyotes, these coyote babies on the left. You can see how small the one in the upper left is. And then on the right is them shortly before we released them. We just released them a few weeks ago. We had 7 coyotes for, I don't know, 5 or 6 months, and it's exciting, but it's sad. You know, you're happy and sad at the same time because you've bonded with these animals and watched them grow from a teeny puppy and a couple of them had mange into these beautiful, you know, looking coyotes, and now they're out hopefully hunting. Right now we have 3 baby orphaned bobcats, and that's been the greatest. So they came in, as you can see, the one where I'm in it's like a pound, they weighed a pound, that one. And the one on the right is a fairly recent picture. They're not that big yet. We've only had them a couple months, so they're still growing, but it's just, I mean, they're the cutest. They're so cute. And they'll be released next spring. We also had a couple of gray foxes that we started with the 2 little babies that were just so teeny. And then here's one of them, beautiful, like, look at that tail. And then he was released this summer as well, both of the gray foxes we had. So that's pretty cool. And oh, that's it. I think that's all of my slides. Okay, I'm going to unshare have I unshared, or am you still looking at my screen? No one's going to tell me.
We still see your screen.
Okay, wait, here we go. I'm going to unshare it. Okay. Pause share, end share, stop share. Are we back to normal? Okay. That's kind of the gist of what we do there. I mean, we do so much, but, you know, feel free to ask any questions. That's kind of the gist. If you have any questions or I can give career advice, whatever you'd like.
I'm curious about you guys' internships. So they're during the summer?
We actually are having them year round now, but there's 3 different sort of blocks. I think there's like a March to May, and then there's like a June to August, and like a September to November, August to, there's like 3 sort of waves. And I think for the first time we're having less interns over the winter, but the winter there's not as much going on. So you can if you just go to the website, there is a listing for it. And now is a good time if you're interested in doing one next spring, because I think it opens up, I think it's open now. And you just apply. And Dennis, who's the hospital manager that does the hiring or the choosing of the interns, he interviews everyone. Like, he's crazy. So I'm sure Michael can give you some tips on what to do. But yeah, so there's a lot of interns, and it's a really good experience. So I would recommend, yeah, just apply for it. I think I had I think I just had one phone interview. I don't know if Michael had anything more than that for the job. Yeah, that was it. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
If I can
And
jump
then-
in real quick. Oh, I just wanted to mention the Bay Foundation also has internships if you guys are looking, and we're just kind of rolling them whenever. So if you guys are interested, feel free to check out our website. We don't have as many fuzzy animals though. So.
Yeah, we'll actually open up questions for like both of you. So if anyone else has any questions for either of our speakers today.
I have a question. My question is more for Dane. It's about restoration. So how have restoration events and just working towards the restoration goal in general, how has that changed the Bay Foundation in the wake of the pandemic? Because, you know, we would attend restorations all the time as members of the public. And we would host our own restorations, but since we rely on volunteers and it's not safe for us to invite them to come with us anymore, it's just all looked really, really different. So I'm curious as to how the Bay Foundation is continuing their work.
Yeah, great question. So I guess everything that we had volunteers doing has fallen to the technicians. So I've only been there for 2 months about right now. But I think a lot of our hands-on maintenance work has kind of been rolled back this year. We've had just limited capacity because we don't have the people out there. Luckily, most of the maintenance isn't too pressing. The interns and the volunteers were most useful in expanding where we had restored, especially in the Biona wetland, where we pulled more ice plant and expanded the area that we had worked on. The restoration event we have going, not next week, but the week after, which if anyone wants to volunteer to help, we need all the help we can. It's pretty exciting. We're completely redoing an area that was destroyed by some illegal dumping by local contractors. So because of that, we actually have the California Conservation Corps coming out to help us out. So that's one way we've been bridging that gap of volunteers, is having more field work for the field technicians, and then the Conservation Corps coming and helping us out. And depending on the project, if we have funding for something like that, we can get it rolling. We also have another project in Malibu that's about to start up, which is pretty exciting. So, does that answer? Yeah.
I had another question for Lisa. Also, I wanted to say that I work with Dan, and I was like freaking out when you said that because he's awesome. But I was just curious, for those of us interested in wildlife rehabilitation, would you recommend vet school or grad school as a better segue into a career like that?
It depends on how, I mean, if you want to be a wildlife vet, yeah, definitely do the vet track. And there's a lot of good programs like in England, I'm aware, like a lot of good vet schools. And what our new vet who's been doing wildlife most of his career said, you know, don't start in domestic animals and think you're going to jump. It's like, if you want wildlife, just start with wildlife and stay with wildlife. That was his advice as a vet. So yeah, so if you want to get that level, I was really lucky that at this job, I didn't have to have like a vet tech certification. I'm considering doing that as well, just while I'm waiting for my PhD. I don't know. But yeah, does that help at all? I think if you want to be in wildlife, just start and stay in wildlife.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a lot. Oh, go ahead.
There's a question in the chat to either of you. Did you find any resistance or advice when changing to different fields?
Oh, I didn't know. I was worried that I would because I was older, but surprisingly, it's worked in my favor. I've gone to a few conferences. That's another thing I recommend doing. I went to a student conservation conference that's annual in New York last year. It just happened last month. And then I was interested in reintroduction, so I went to the IUCN reintroduction specialist group and just went to their conference and I met all these people. I just knew nothing. But I think for me, being older, it actually turned out well, especially, I don't know if anybody is interested in a PhD, but from talking to a lot of different PhD advisors, the good thing about being older is I have a track record that I can complete things. And it's such a big investment for a school to work with a student to get a PhD. And there's a fairly high percentage that don't finish. And then that investment is gone. So in some senses, that's good. So it's focus. And yes, but I haven't really, it's actually been surprisingly beneficial, I think, except UCLA. And I will say this, is that I think they prefer to have PhD students that are younger and then will provide more, work back to UCLA and have a longer career. So I don't think they tend to take a lot of older students like myself for some of those PhD roles, but that's just a school thing.
Yeah, to kind of go with that, I'm definitely not that much older, but a couple of years of work experience between my undergrad degree and going back for graduate school and getting a real job in the field, I think was extremely beneficial. And having that experience in the security field, there's a lot of skills that translate from pretty much any field to any other field. So a lot of the practice just organizing these insane last minute events for clients and trying to put together a security detail for a celebrity going out to a club at 4 o'clock in the morning. Just these last minute logistical challenges, really taking those skills to the environmental field has been really beneficial. So whatever you do, whether it's a hobby or another career or whatever it is, there'll be useful skills that you can bring. And like Lisa was saying, I definitely feel a lot more confident in my graduate school program now than I would have if I had gone straight into it from undergrad. And I'm a much better student and better environmentalist and scientist now than I was coming out of undergrad. So
I 100% agree with that. Like my first master's I did right after undergrad, like a year in between. I was like, I just didn't care. I just wanted the paper. But this one, I mean, I got 4.0. Like I got straight A's just because I was so into it, So it was, because I cared more and I knew what I wanted more. And I think a lot of times when you go to grad school early, it's kind of like, well, there's no job, so I might as well just go. And, it's like maybe not always for the passion. So, but when you find the passion, it's fun. Yeah, school is fun.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I actually have one for you, Lisa. Regarding like all of your trips to Africa, what would you say was the biggest revelation about like the conservation field that you had?
I think it's just how integrated all of it is. It's as far as you can't exist in a vacuum as a animal. There's so many things that are connected that you have to work with in so many different avenues, and a lot of it is just not. I think one of the big surprises is it's just really daunting work, and when you really start digging into the realities of poaching and things like that, like there's it's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, like what's happening. It can be depressing. And I've seen there's actually a few papers written about scientists becoming depressed because, you feel like you're rolling a boulder up the hill. And I feel that way a lot, that what I do is not gonna matter, but I think it does matter. Jane Goodall, I have kids, and Jane Goodall actually came to my son's school a couple of years ago and gave a speech. And she said, what I really loved was she said, just, you don't have to do a big thing. You just have to do your little thing and do it well. So if you can just, so I have to constantly remind myself to stay micro and not get too macro at the overwhelming odds against us with every issue in conservation, and just focus on, well, hopefully there's 1,000 other me's that are doing this one little thing. I'm going to do this one little thing, and hopefully it all adds up to make some sort of a difference. But if we don't try, then there's no hope. So I struggle with that a lot. It's hard. It's, I mean, Dane, do you see that? Like when you see, trends and stuff and your restoration projects, it can be just,
Absolutely. And like that quote I mentioned from Chasing Coral was one of the inspirations for me to really go back and pursue the environmental career. But another one was the poem, "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night." And that's kind of my feelings towards this, that it may not be something that, it may not be a battle that we win, but I'd rather be on the side of trying than just letting it happen. So.
Yeah. And, I made really good money in my last career, and, now I make $15 an hour, and which is less than I made in my first assistant job, but I've never been happier, and I really feel fulfilled and happy. And like what I'm doing, is a positive thing for the world. And that's it's a nice way to live after being in entertainment, which, people need entertainment, but, it doesn't always attract some of the greatest people. But the people I work with in conservation, like, because no one's doing it for the money, like they really care about it. And it's really nice to work with people who really care. And, after 20 years in cynical corporate America, when no one cares about anything but themselves, it's cool. It's a cool way to collaborate. So, it's great.
Yeah, I love my job. I love my coworkers, so I wouldn't trade it for quite a bit of money.
All right, if there's no more questions, thank you all for coming out. We hope that you were able to get a lot out of this talk, and that you were able to gain some insight on the field of ecology and like the different, sometimes unusual pathways to get there. And we'd like to also thank the speakers. Thank you so much for coming out and sharing all of your vast knowledge with us.
My pleasure. And, just good luck. I mean, you just hang in there. Don't let anybody tell you no. Just do it. I'm really excited that there's another generation of people that want to do it too. They want to help.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, guys. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.